Okay, so now what we're going to do is graph with a phase shift. So when you're graphing with a phase shift, you're going to think about what would be an easy scale to use on your x-axis. And this, of course, is going to be your phase shift or your B value. That way, if you shift over on the graph one unit, that unit is going to represent the phase shift. So for example, if we were graphing part A, pi over 2 would be a good scale. For B, pi over 8, and then for C, pi over 3. Okay, that way if we're shifting the units over, we just have to shift over one unit. So let's take a look at our next example. So for this, we're going to find the amplitude, the period, the phase shift, and graph one complete period. So here's our equation, y equals 3 cosine of x plus pi over 4. Our amplitude value is going to be 3, which comes from our a value here. Our period is going to be 2 pi because we're doing 2 pi over k, and our k value here is just going to be 1. And then our phase shift is going to be negative pi over 4. Now again, remember it's negative because it's x minus the value. So really this is x minus a negative pi over 4, which is why we see the positive here. So we're going pi over 4 units left. Our b is going to be negative pi over 4. So since we're shifting pi over 4 units left, pi over 4 would be a great choice for the intervals on your x-axis. And if we're going to graph one period, we can start at negative pi over 4, and then we can go to our b value plus the period, or negative pi over 4 plus 2 pi. So if we did negative pi over 4 plus 2 pi, remember that's the same thing as 8 pi over 4. So 8 pi minus pi would be 7 pi, so it would be 7 pi over 4, and this would be a good scale to use. Okay, so now we're going to label our x-axis. Okay, so like I said, pi over 4 is going to be a great unit to use. Now you don't have to label every single one of these, but we're going to label just about every other one. So this is 1 pi over 4. The next one would be 2 pi over 4, and 2 pi over 4 is going to be pi over 2. Okay, then we have 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, which is pi, 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, which 6 pi over 4 is 3 pi over 2, 7 pi over 4, and then 2 pi. Right, now if you want to label all of those, you can. In fact, I might just label them so that you can understand where our values are coming from. But all of these values for this one are going to be values on our unit circle. So it's going to be really easy to find those values. And then this here is going to be negative 1 pi over 4. Negative 2 pi over 4, negative pi over 2, etc. Okay, and then this is going to be our y value. Okay. All right. So there are going to be two different ways that you can think about this. Now, the first way is if you look at your equation and you think of your parent function without the phase shift, your parent function would be y equals 3 times the cosine of just x. So if we can make a table for this and then go ahead and then just shift that negative pi over 4 units, okay, or pi over 4 units left, that would be a very easy way to do our graph. So our x and our y values. Our x value, you can start with pi over 4. Now you don't have to plug in every single value you have there. In fact, I would start with 0, and I would do all of the normal values that we do, like 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, and then I would shift those values. So if we were to do that, your cosine at 0 is going to be what? Yep, 1. So 1 times 3 is going to be 3. At pi over 2, your cosine value is going to be 0. So 0 times 3 will be 0. At pi, your cosine is negative 1. So negative 1 times 3 is negative 3. And at 3 pi over 2, your cosine value is 0, so this is going to be 0. And then at 2 pi, it's 1, so 1 times 3 is going to be 3. Okay, so what you could do is you could go to your graph and say, okay, I know at 0, I'm at 3 for my parent function. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shift it to the left. So I would be right here. You could do the same thing at pi over 2. So if you go to pi over 2 and you say, okay, I know this is at 0, and shift it to the left, there we are at pi over 4. If at pi, we're at negative 3, 1, 2, 3, and then I shift it over here, you could keep going that way. Okay, so that's the first way, is just shifting it. Now, the other thing you could do is you could actually plug these units into your original equation, and you could do it from there. So if you said, okay, I know it's y equals 3 cosine of x plus pi over 4, and I want to do my xy for this, now you could start doing 0, pi over 4, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, pi, and you could just plot your points like normal. So if you plugged in 0, this is going to be 3 cosine of 0 plus pi over 4, or pi over 4. Okay, so your cosine at pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. So this would really be 3 root 2 over 2. Okay, now that would be hard to do without a calculator. So you might want to try a different value. If you do pi over 4, you could do 3 cosine of pi over 4 plus pi over 4, which really would just be 3 times the cosine of 2 pi over 4, and 2 pi over 4 is pi over 2. The cosine at pi over 2 is going to be 0, so this is going to be 0. Now this would be one that you could plot on your graph, and that could be 0. So you still could do it that way. It's just with some of these you would get decimal answers, and you would just keep going until you got your whole number answers without your calculator. Alright, so I'm going to keep going with my method that I did here. So if I have 3 pi over 2, 0, then I'm just going to shift this over here, and then at 2 pi I was at 3. So at 2 pi I'm at 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to put that right here. Okay, and then you can curve these. Oops, sorry. What did I do wrong here? We have to do what? So it's not 2 pi 3. It's going to be, yeah, shift it over to 7 pi over 4. Alright, so that is the one drawback of doing that. Sometimes if you're going too fast, you might accidentally put it there. But if you're a teacher, you have white out. Woot woot, so just white it out. Alright, now when you connect these, you're going to connect them with a curve. And then I want you to keep going. I want you to keep spanning the graph, because really it's just going to keep repeating itself. Remember how I told you today, directly in between the two maximums is going to be the min? So look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 spaces in between. So the min should occur at 1, 2, 3, 4. And look, it does. In between those two is going to cross 0. So if that's 4 units, at 1, 2 units, it should be crossing 0. So that means if I go 2 more units over, I should be crossing here at 0. So I know this is going to continue this way. Okay, and then here, if I go 2 more units over, this will be crossing here. Oh, and then my graph looks so beautiful. All right, nice job.